Welcome, everybody. My name is James Dyke, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute. And I see that our current glorious leader and director, Peter Cox, has just appeared. We're multitasking today. I think there is some childcare going on in the background. So welcome, Peter, and welcome everybody else. And I'm really pleased to welcome Henry and the gang from the 10 New Insights in Climate Science Initiative. And that's what this session is going to be about. We're going to hear from 3 of the authors of this latest report. And after that, there's going to be an opportunity to pose questions, maybe have some comments. So we expect to have a kind of a 40-minute talking session and then a 20-minute Q&A. Very soon, I'm going to hand over to Henry, who's going to introduce the authors and then also a bit of background and motivation about the initiative. But before I do that, I need to make an announcement, which is if I just very briefly share my screen, it's the Global Tipping Points Conference. Can we all see that? Is that happening now? Yep. Okay. So
now, yeah.
From the 30th of June to the 3rd of July, in the University of Exeter's Streatham campus, we will be having the next Global Tipping Points Conference. Registration for the conference closes on the 12th of June, and the abstract call is closing pretty soon. We will be looking at climate tipping points risks, so-called social positive tipping points and opportunities, research impact action, and there is going to be a very large community from not just academia, but also business, policymakers and NGOs. We will have over 30 inspiring keynote speakers, the names and some pictures you can see here. And this gives a kind of a representation of just the breadth of the conference now. So it's well beyond the still quite narrow, I suppose, scientific examination of climate tipping points. We're talking about social systems, we're talking about beyond the sciences across all aspects of academia and well beyond academia itself. And as well as those plenary sessions, we've got a large number, I think 50, there might even be more than 50 workshops and research sessions, which are going to be much smaller, much more focused opportunities for you to look at Earth system tipping points, the potential impacts and opportunities in governance, and also producing positive social change. So yes, that call for abstracts, if you want to present your work in a poster or in some other kind of format during the workshops, then the call for abstract closes on the 19th of March. So 19th of March to get your abstracts in, and the registration closes on the 17th of June. And I will stop the advert there. And without further ado, I will hand over to Henry. So please, Henry, introduce the initiatives and our co-authors today.
Great. Can everybody see my screen?
That looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henry Wu. I work at the Climate Service Center Germany, and I am part of the Secretariat for the Earth League. And I'm here to introduce to you the 10 New Insights in Climate Science. I will go over quickly of what the initiative is and the process of choosing the 10 New Insights every year and how that information is disseminated. Okay. So what is the 10 New Insights? It is an annual synthesis that highlights the essential recent advances in climate change research from the natural sciences to the social sciences with high policy relevance. And so the 10 New Insights is really actually 2 publications. The first publication is the academic manuscript. This academic manuscript sort of underpins the policy report that is also published, and it is relevant for scientific researchers who want a better understanding of scientific research areas beyond their field of expertise. So it is published annually in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It has been published in the past in Global Sustainability, and this year it will be published in One Earth. And the second publication is the policy report, and this is geared towards the negotiators and others that are involved in the UNFCCC process. They are the policymakers, business leaders from civil society, and more broadly NGOs and all interested parties. So here on this slide, you can see the editorial board members that curated this particular edition of the 10 New Insights from 2024. I'm not going to read through all the names, but you will recognize a lot of familiar faces, such as the co-chairs of the Earthly, Johann Rockstrom and Peter Schlosser. And for this year, the 2025 edition, Professor Peter Cox is actually on the editorial board as well. And so just to quickly go through the process of this initiative, the 10 New Insights, every year there's an international open call, runs about from December, January until February, that calls for input and suggestions and nominations on what is the most important climate change research advancement for the most recent past year. And so these are mostly peer-reviewed scientific publications. You can see sort of here on the right, what is sort of how the entries are curated. There's the key recent advance and sort of the reference that goes with it, the scientific research publication, peer-reviewed publication that goes with it. And so in this open call, we collected over 200 suggestions, nominations for the year, from the year 2023. And then this is discussed with the editorial board, sort of scoping down to the 10 most important entries. So this was obviously not easy, as many great scientific contributions were not included, but that is not the goal, to include all the most interesting, what we feel, the editorial board feels is the most interesting for science policy knowledge here. And so we arrived at the final list of 10 for this year, the 2024-2025. I'm not going to read them all, but you can go to our 10 New Insights webpage and read the report directly. In today's webinar, we will feature insight number 4, climate extremes are harming maternal and reproductive well-being. And we will highlight insight number 8, the new framework for climate resilient development in cities, provide decision makers with ideas for unlocking co-benefits. And finally, we will talk about insight number 10, public acceptance of or resistance to climate policies crucially depends on perceptions of fairness. And so these insights were picked by the editorial board, and we invited the anchoring papers, the key reference, through our literature search, and we invited the main authors from those publications to join us in writing this, in writing these 2 publications. And so the job is not done once the report is published and the academic manuscript is published. So really, the launch is the launch. It is really just the beginning, that there's still a large follow-up after the launch of the report. And this is actually the most crucial part, because this is where we reach out to policymakers and parties at the COP through our press conference with the UNFCCC. And last year, we did an online launch because of the limitations at COP29 in Baku. But normally, we have side events, as you can see here, with our partner institutions and at the on-site pavilions at the COP. And so we hold webinars such as the one that we're having today to really disseminate and get the report highlights out to as many people and outlets as possible. So, okay, that's enough from me. We will go into our 3 insights for today. Insight number 4, climate extremes are harming maternal and reproductive well-being, with our speaker, Professor Melanie Böckmann from University of Bremen, Germany. And we have insight number 8, the new frameworks for climate resilient development in cities provide decision makers with ideas for unlocking co-benefits, with our speaker, Zeenat Niazi from TERI School of Advanced Studies from India. And finally, we have insight number 10, the public's acceptance of or resistance to climate policies crucially depends on perception of fairness, with Assistant Professor Roberto Cardinal from the University College London. And so now I will hand over the microphone to Melanie, Professor Böckmann from the University of Bremen.
Thank you, Henry, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your interest in this. I'm going to try and share again. Classic Zoom question. If you do see the wrong screen with all the notes, just do let me know, please. Yeah, I'm so glad to be here today to be speaking a bit about maternal and reproductive well-being, of course, in a very time that is quite volatile towards maternal and reproductive well-being overall, which I think we didn't anticipate last year. I want to say in the beginning that, of course, I was not the main author of the insight. It's always a collaborative endeavor. And we have Adelaide Lusambili, Cheng He, and Santosh Pandipati, who were the co-authors, and of course, our excellent coordinator, Nilushi Kumarasinghe, who actually did not just coordinate, she wrote a lot of this insight, and we are super thankful, because otherwise I don't think this would have happened. So why do we need this insight? For us, it's important, or at least for me now, representing maybe just my own views, we have these two key messages that you can find in the insight. One is that entrenched gender norms and low levels of income and education, so social aspects, further amplify the impacts of climate change on maternal and reproductive health. And I want to stress the importance of viewing climate change and climate extremes and health. I'm a public health researcher, so that is, of course, close to my heart, in general, through a socially informed lens, rather than just as a purely biophysiological lens. Because how women conceive, are pregnant, give birth always occurs within social environments, not just within a physical environment, for instance. And those realities actually shape their bodily experiences as well. Currently, studies that we included, studies that are being done, usually do not ask about gender identity. So it probably would be more correct to say people with the uterus who give birth, but we'll stick to women for this presentation and for the insight. In order to sort of highlight why this is needed, I chose to go outside of the actual insight a bit, because you can actually all look that up online and read it very easily. And the points that are driven home are basically the same. A recent review by Lakou et al. From WITS Planetary Health Research, just published in Nature Medicine, they did a systematic review and meta-analysis of 198 studies across 66 countries, detailing some of the risks of the example of heat specifically. Of course, climate extremes are not just heat. There's also different aspects such as flooding, hurricane storms, wildfires, and so on. But of course, heat is one of the more well-researched examples when looking at maternal and reproductive health. The insight is based on different studies, but this review is just very helpful because it nicely illustrates 2 points. One is the geographical distribution of knowledge and the effect directions that we know so far, that I will go to with the next slide. Here you can already see a main challenge for this insight overall is that we do not have enough evidence for low and middle income countries, where, of course, you know, the impacts of climate extremes are often much, much worse than in more resourced countries, in more resourced health context. You can see here the number of studies found in the different temperature regions even sort of do not represent necessarily where we would need more studies. You can see that countries that have more heat extremes, for instance, are less well represented in research, which is, of course, an issue that we have in all of Western regular research due to publication resources and so on. So why did we look into maternal and reproductive health? One reason is that, of course, the anatomical and physiological changes during pregnancy can alter thermal regulation capacities. We have an increased cardiac output and plasma volume, and that is coupled with heat generated by the fetal metabolism, additional fat deposits, and all those biophysiological effects sort of heighten the vulnerability of pregnant women to extreme heat exposure, especially in the later stages of pregnancy, is where we have some evidence. These responses for sort of maintaining a thermal gradient for heat loss from the fetus can be dampened if the mother has hypertension, sepsis, or underlying medical conditions. So that means there is, of course, an additional risk if you have, well, I guess most of those are not actually pre-existing conditions, but if it's coupled with other acute conditions during pregnancy. What we do not know yet is the exact physiological pathway. So there are definitely more studies needed on that. I think the same research group is also conducting a study in South Africa on sort of the more biological effects of heat on the body. We work predominantly with epidemiological data at the moment, obviously, so further research and science would be helpful to have. However, the epidemiological evidence we do have does show associations, which means that if you look at number of effect estimates here, we can see that there is a lot of correlation between certain outcomes of maternal health, of fetal health, and extreme heat events. numbers here. These are findings from a meta-analysis, and the study found that for every 1 degree in Celsius increase in heat exposure, there was a 4% increase in preterm birth risk across all the studies. So during a heat wave, the risk of preterm birth increased by 26%. And similarly, they found marked increases in other adverse outcomes, such as risk for gestational diabetes, stillbirth, congenital anomalies, and obstetric complications with increasing exposure to heat. We do not have much research yet on outcomes like antenatal bleeding or cesarean section risks that may be related to heat exposure, but may also be related more than to the health services side. So these numbers are just to show you that from the studies that were included in the systematic review, we can see that specifically for preterm birth and low birth weight, we do have a lot of indications that those are closely associated with the climate extreme of extreme heat. And you can imagine that interventions such as providing cooling spaces, providing green shading in cities and so on are not interventions that are consistently being done even in high resource settings, but definitely not in low resource settings. So this is the figure from our insight, and it's supposed to drive home the point of what are potential solutions to this. We chose to have this sort of impact pathway plus socioeconomic factors equation that then says there are impacts on maternal and reproductive health. Of course, things are always a bit more complex. There's pathways also back from socioeconomic factors, and impacts from maternal and reproductive health would have sort of back influence on socioeconomic factors. So if you are harmed during childbirth or pregnancy, if you maybe have to take care later on of an infant that was born prematurely and so on, that will again impact your ability to provide an income, for example, and that may affect again your additional exposure to heat if you no longer can afford air conditioning, for instance. What I think is really important to see here is that it is not enough to address climate change from a medical perspective, even though I just said very medically specific outcomes. It would not be the right approach to say the solution comes from the health sector. That is definitely one part of it, but it's not going to be the main part of it. So you see below that, yes, we want to fill epidemiological data gaps, improve education. We want to have awareness campaigns across healthcare services, and we also want healthcare services to be sort of equipped with the technology, if that is needed, with the building standards to ensure that there is less exposure to climate extremes. But we do need to integrate maternal and reproductive health into all climate change and adaptation plans and urban planning across sectors. So it cannot stay within the health sector to be able to make an impact, because as you can see in the figure, these socioeconomic factors are not negligible. Those are very important aspects. And that is also why we put below that strength and gender equity and justice are basically prerequisites to having positive impacts on maternal and reproductive health, because gender inequity again influences so much your socioeconomic access, your access to healthcare, your access to reproductive choice, which also impacts how well you can deal with the pregnancy, how well you can provide for health risk during pregnancy, and so on. So I think this insight is really very much needed right now. And previously, I always would have said, if we talk about climate change and women's health, it's not enough to just look at maternal and reproductive health, and I still stand by that. There is more to women's health and climate change than just reproductive health, but it is such an important aspect of your sort of health life course perspective if you are able to conceive children, that it is just fundamental to also look at this perspective. And so I haven't really looked at the watch, but I think I can just show the policy implication slide. And here we try to make some connections to other higher level frameworks, such as the framework for global climate resilience, where you could also recognize maternal and reproductive health as a key area of concern and make sure that we do have access to awareness, knowledge, but also the structures in place for community groups, such as maternal health workers and support groups, traditional birth attendants, and so on. But also to make sure that at a different sector level and as a higher level, for instance, we can institutionalize labor guidelines to protect pregnant women. Because if you do not go to work because it is an extreme heat event, you may be at risk of being fired if there isn't a specific welfare type of state or labor protection policies in place. So with that, I want to conclude with just highlighting some of the importance of the maternal and reproductive health, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A later on.
Okay, great. So we will now move over to our next speaker with Zeenat in insight number 8. Zeenat, you're still muted.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So thanks a lot, Henry and Harry, for this invitation to speak on the Insight 8, which, like the earlier Insight, is not a singular effort. You can see Ursula, Tisha, Ayub, Van Ho, and Gilles. Gilles also coordinating and writing considerable parts of the Insight. It's been a collaborative effort. We began by looking at why we should be focusing on cities. Although the editorial board had sort of identified urban issues and adaptation, we sort of enlarged it to looking at urban issues and cities and resilience, much larger than just simple adaptation. But this inspired in the sense by the AR6 of looking at pathways for building resilience, we looked at what cities have been, the situation in the cities at the moment. We are looking at over 68% by the 2050, 68% of world's population becoming urban by 2050. We're looking at a situation where cities are major contributors to GHG emissions and therefore to climate change, but they're also increasingly impacted by what's happening due to climate change. The fact that you have large numbers of people together in dense populations, you enhance exposure and vulnerabilities, not just to human beings and their lives, but to infrastructure, to economies. And so you have an overall increased vulnerability and exposure in urban situations. And despite such large populations that are going to be living in urban areas, very few cities integrate both adaptation mitigation strategies within their urban plans. And this was recognized very much by the country members and negotiators at the COPs, and the climate change commitment that was made, the outcome statement at Dubai, and then followed up in Baku, has been signed up by 75 current signatories, which include countries, which also include non-governmental agencies. They include organizations that are think tanks and private sector, which is called the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. This is still an ongoing, it's a very, very new sort of initiative of agencies coming together to look at how local actions at city level can be supported through multiple sectors and multiple partnerships coming together. So cities obviously are a very important place to address. They're also, in a sense, the geography, the spatial space where all SDGs collate and come together. We know that about 80 of the 100 fastest growing cities are in Asia and Africa, home to over 3 billion people, and have multiple climate change risks, not just in terms of degrees of risk, but also in the multiple typologies of risks that these cities are exposed to. And a lot of them are very important commercial capitals. And so these are at national level economies that get affected. We also know that data in the last couple of years indicates to us that the way city urban planning science is being looked at, we cannot look at it as a one sort of solution for everybody, or one framework for all the kind of cities, because there are cities in different stages of growth and development, and cities that each of them face distinct challenges, not just because they might be rapidly growing, or they might be shrinking due to out migration and aging, or they might be established and stagnant, but there are also cities that are stuck with historical legacies of urban planning, where infrastructure changes cannot be made too much, require high capital investments, and so they make quick fixes and short-term interventions and lead to maladaptation. You have cities which require large capital investments just to maintain their infrastructure so that they can handle climate risks, and because of shrinking populations, they're no longer viable. So it's, so different cities have very different challenges. The rapidly growing cities in the global south, most of them, are also in the more vulnerable situation, and also suffer from adaptive capacity gaps. We see, I mean, you can see the sort of references that we were looking at, and not just in the recent ones between 22 and 24, but also the new research coming in now in 25, and some earlier very significant research of the early 20s. And we realize that most of the responses are very unidimensional, very techno-centric responses. And so the cities would either be looking at very mitigation-focused interventions or adaptation-focused inputs, are prioritizing one over the other based on what their major challenges and how their budgets are sort of planned, and the limitations of their finances. We also see from over 343 cities whose data has been collected by the climate disclosure projects, that a lot of the emissions per capita are coming from the global south, although the global north, rapidly growing cities, at the city level, their carbon footprints are increasing quite rapidly. So the delta change in the GHG footprints is much higher if you go down to the global south, but the per capita emissions still stay very high in the global north. We looked then at how do we address, and how is science looking at addressing these multiple challenges that need to be contextualized and brought down at the local level, and the framework that this insight basically has brought forward from the science in the last few years is the framework of the socio-ecological technological systems approach, which looks at processes at the interface socioeconomic, socio-ecological, and ecological, techno-ecological. We also find that if you're looking at this kind of an integrated framework supported by smart solutions and technologies, then the adoption of the SETS approach is much better within both global north, global south cities, variety of city development sort of contexts, but cities have very low access to global metadata, especially the global south cities. And so that becomes a limitation. But we also find that this enables local action design and implementation within the larger global SDG agenda. So let's see how this approach really works, taking an example, and we discussed heat, and so we take the heat forward into the city planning space in this insight, and we said, okay, if you are looking at the standard traditional unidimensional technological approach, then it addresses singularly either mitigation or adaptation. Let's say you're looking at a building at urban heat, and oftentimes you're looking at it through the design. Or you take the technical data, design and temperature data. You end up with designing passive buildings, and you look at and probably efficiency gains in energy and mitigation, JG mitigation as seen. But we also see here there are trade-offs with respect to ecological gains. There are missed opportunities, and you are not able to address everybody between the different socioeconomic strata. If you look at it from the two-dimensional perspective, you add on limited local biodiversity data to the technical data, then you get into solutions which are sort of more nature-based but limited. And you know, things like green roofs, you have natural ventilations that are looked at, but again you miss out on the social interactions, engagements, and sometimes often there is impacts of gentrification. So there is unintended consequences of these two-dimensional sort of interventions. But as soon as you start looking at it from a multidimensional socio-ecological technical approach, then you find that you're looking at it at different scales. You're also looking at it in different times. You're looking at different knowledge systems. You're looking at integrating society and social concerns, and you start having a more systemic approach and more multiple functions and multiple benefits, co-benefits that you can start bringing in through behavioral shifts, through other, including the technical aspects, but also behavioral shifts and other such solutions. So the suggestions, therefore, we had for the policymakers was, if we are looking at operationalizing the CHAMP joint declaration, then we require cities and local governments to be empowered to strengthen their action at the local level through multi-level collaborations. And this will require cities to start adopting sets approaches to serve them as guidelines for operationalizing their climate plans. And this will enable contextualization of interventions. So you can look at the unique ecological and social vulnerability context of each city, depending on which stage of development that it is in. And supported by big data analytics and AI tools, city governments would be able to maximize co-benefits and manage their trade-offs. But in all of this, the caution really is that the policy interventions must recognize that there are entrenched vulnerabilities and socioeconomic inequities in large parts of the world. And they could be because of past urban planning legacies. They could be because of the high-risk informal settlements, huge informality in the global south. It could be because new green policies lead to climate gentrification as well. But bringing in the sets approach will allow the questions to be asked and solutions to be found to prevent reinforcing this injustice and maladaptation. Policymakers further require that in order to operationalize this approach, multi-level, multi-actor capacity building will be needed, and of course institutional partnerships, which will necessarily include local communities and the private sector. So because we are looking at local actions to the larger global climate problem, it's essential that the local actors be involved in the process. So I will end at that. Thank you, and hand it over back to you, Henry.
Thank you. And for our last speaker for the day, we have Assistant Professor Cardinal from University College London to talk about insight number 10. Roberta, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, Henry. Yes. Can you see my screen now? Henry,
yeah,
can you see my screen?
You can put it in presentation mode and then.
Yeah, can you see now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to present Insight 10, Resistance and Acceptance of Climate Policy, also on behalf of my co-authors. So basically what we are trying to do in this paper is to understand how climate policies can drive to social resistance. So in this first slide, as a context, I'm going to mention two typologies of climate policies that sometimes drive resistance, which are fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon taxes. So the first one is is implemented by state in order to withdraw state subsidies to fossil fuels. And the second one, the carbon taxes, usually have a similar effect. So basically what happens is that energy prices, fossil fuel prices increase. And for this reason, often we can observe some opposition to this kind of reforms. Of course, the goal of these policies are to benefit the environment because of decreasing CO2 emissions. At the same time, it is also believed that these types of climate policies have also economic and strategic advantages. First of all, because they can unlock public financial resources and allow for investment in cleaner energy, but also there is room for more social welfare. So the idea is to reconcile, on the one hand, environmental sustainability, on the other hand, also economic benefits. However, we observe that often there is opposition, social and political opposition to this type of climate policies. So I just wanted to show a conceptual framework to understand how climate policies could be accepted or opposed. So this is a paper that I've written previous to join this research team. Basically, what I found is that one of the key for acceptance is to balance social, political, and industrial interest. And the way to do that, it's on the one hand to design policies in a way that is consider political economy factors specific to each country or local context. And so the literature emphasized the need to consider different aspects when we talk about policy design, and in particular the timing of the policy. For example, we need to consider the economic context or electoral phases. Also, it's important to understand the socioeconomic incidence of these policies. So who is going to pay for the climate policies, especially when we talk about short-term costs that sometimes are needed to afford. And then what kind of compensations are envisaged for the society, and how to effectively communicate the benefits of climate policies. So these are best practices highlighted by the literature. But also what I contributed in terms of that is to understand how these general policy practices should be tailored in specific political economy context, and in particular to understand the specificity of the energy sector, so whether a country has available renewable energy, and also the role of specific social and industrial groups and how they are able to influence policymaking and the broader economic and policy context. Next slide, please. So in the Insight 10, we extended this framework and we provided further insight, especially by bridging, this policy and structural aspect that I just mentioned, with also anthropological and sociological consideration, which are also very important. And we suggest that the acceptance or resistance to climate policies very much depend on the perception by people, especially perception of fairness, which change across contexts, which is something that in the literature is not always emphasized. And in particular, we focus on three elements: individual beliefs, social norms, and cultural identities. Next slide, please. So, in terms of individual beliefs, it is important to emphasize that peoples have a different way to prioritize. You know, they have different priorities in terms of climate goals versus, for example, development goals. Sometimes they may clash in the short term, but there are ways to reconcile them at the same time. But here we're talking about perception by people. And also the perception of fairness in terms of who is paying in the short term versus who should pay, you know, which affect how people perceive these policies. In terms of cultural identities, it's also important to understand how climate policies impact the social fabric or social networks and livelihoods of people. For example, in the context of green projects, and sometimes this implies that people have to be relocated, and there are implications for jobs and the economy. So this is another very important aspect. And lastly, we analyze also the role of social norms, because we want to emphasize the fact that there are different ways to manifest either support or resistance to climate policies. And for example, sometimes quite resistance could be misunderstood as support, for example, because of the prevailing social norms or cultural aspects. But also sometimes we can witness manifest opposition, including civil unrest sometimes. But even in this case, it's very important to differentiate and interpret, you know, the prevailing social norms, because sometimes civil unrest is triggered by a minority, and it doesn't really represent the majority of the people, but these groups are very motivated and very well organized. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, increasing acceptance of climate policies require balancing industrial, political, and social interests, but also beliefs. And we argue that research is essential in this phase to inform policy and to overcome the current gaps or policy failures. This is important to better understand the interest of influential social and industrial groups by considering the specific context, both local or national, but also how these interact with broader socioeconomic trends, including, for example, globalization or liberalization policies, because sometimes the short-term costs that some climate policies entail sum up with some broader global trends. And so it's important to differentiate them and identify when is the best timing to implement the climate policies. And so we believe that this research and analytical effort would help policy better identify the affected social groups, to better tailor climate policies to fit specific needs and realities, but also to develop more effective communication strategies, because this would increase the awareness of people, but not only of people, also the awareness of policymakers, to better communicate the benefits of climate policies. And lastly, to also design mechanisms of more inclusive decision making, especially for the people who are, or the social group who are affected by that. Thank you very much.
That was great. Many thanks. Okay, so we have some questions already in the chat, but please do add your further questions and comments. So I'm just going to go right from the top because I think maybe the first question was from Peter. I don't know, Peter, if you actually are available.
I am. Thank you. Thank you, James, and thanks to speakers. And this question was specifically in response to what Melanie said. So you rightfully said that this sort of co-variation of poverty issues and social issues with extreme temperatures. I just wondered how, and you may have said this, but I may have missed it, how you separate those two things out when you're trying to analyze, especially observational data.
Yeah.
It's a tricky question, that I know.
I guess the answer is not enough. So yeah, I mean, the question is, what is the heat and what is poverty in this particular context with the poorest? I think if we look from the health perspective, the tricky thing is that, as you say, with health, everything is always interconnected. So we talk about these mediated pathways, you know, access to healthcare, sort of what you are exposed to besides the extreme heat event. So I do not think that we have 100%, like if we would do it in a lab, clear answer. That's why we talk about these associations, correlations. Sometimes studies that are being done in athletes show different results where they do not necessarily observe adverse effects. So there's that one does have to look maybe a bit more about the biological pathways in the specific context. Depending on how good the data are, so if there are birth register data, for instance, that are very specific also in collecting socioeconomic data, then epidemiologically you can calculate out some of those confounders, but it really depends on what all you have available. So the answer is we cannot completely separate those two. And from a public health perspective, we would say it's good info to be as close sort of to this pure view of what is that exact impact as possible, but our bodies and our experiences, everything is always exposed to multiple things at once. So in reality, the question then is, if we did separate it out in a lab, would it matter as much in the lived context? So
that's a very good point. Maybe the key issue is just that these separate issues often exacerbate each other, don't they? Whether it's exposure to poor people or elderly people or young people to extremes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, I'm somewhat mindful of the time now because I realize we've only got 7 minutes left, and I've also noted, JF, you put your hand up. Is that related to what Peter's talking to Melanie about now, or if it's a question, you can get to the back of the queue? So what was your contribution, JF?
It's a question.
Well, you've unmuted yourself now, so you might as well ask it. Go on.
Okay, I had two questions.
Well, you can have one because there's some other questions as well.
Okay, well, for Roberto, then my comment was that it seemed in the presentation that implicitly we're thinking about carbon pricing as the policy design, and this may or may not be the case, and perhaps needs clarification. But in I think reality, there are almost no countries that use the carbon pricing or taxing as a policy instrument for decarbonization. It's much more subsidies and tax breaks that has been happening. I think it's more in the literature where the carbon tax takes a prominence. I say that I worked at the World Bank 2 years, and we were looking at that quite extensively. So carbon taxes play a little bit of a role, say the EU ETS and the UK's carbon price floor, to reduce, say, have coal to gas switching. But in reality, it's other policies that bring renewables to market, and solar PV being now the cheapest energy technology in the world, it's actually profitable. So I think the question has flipped around to, instead of saying who's going to pay and is there equity in that, it's more like who's going to get the returns on investment and is there equity in that? If you have a comment on that.
Yeah, so you think that it is more in terms of who is going to have the returns, but yeah, even in terms of the, if we don't want to discuss about the carbon taxes, the fossil fuel subsidy reforms, I would, even in this field, I would suggest that if the state withdraw the subsidies, somebody will pay, because it means that fuel prices will increase. And so the social or industrial groups that mostly use fuel will be affected. So I still see, somehow somebody who pay more than others when these policies are done. And there is evidence in terms of very strong opposition in some countries, including sometimes civil unrest, that tells that. But of course, it's very interesting what you say in terms of the returns from the investment. I think you referred to green energy, or so this is also, I think, it will be a very good topic to explore, but I think the situation is a little bit preliminary, is a bit early maybe to try to understand that, but I think it's a very good future research question. I don't know if I'd answered. It's just a comment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I can see that there's been some questions and there's some kind of discussion in the chat. But I'm going down, and I did actually. Oh, hang on. There's a new comment that's come in. Hang on a second. Oh no, that's fine. So I actually had a question for Zeenat, which was about the you're looking at the kind of the adaptive socio-ecological technological responses in the context of urbanization. I'm kind of interested, do you see any evidence for potential counter-urbanization as a result of climate change? So what are the adaptive limits of some of these cities?
I think the evidence of what we might call ruralization, of moving back, is there, but not very much so. I'd say that we do see out migration from cities, but we find that the trends in the fastest growing places are actually all towards either rural transformation or in migration into the cities. So despite the fact that the cities are becoming more vulnerable and they're much higher risks, the pull factor into the city is much higher. That of the economic benefits, the short-term and the medium-term economic benefits, the education benefits, the promise of a better life, of a better economy is much higher. Most of Africa, you will find that in Nigeria, specifically South Africa. You find this in Asia. The Latin American countries are almost 80% urbanized, and you don't see that much ruralization happening there. In the United States, you have some evidence, but there is land. So we also need to understand that the out-migration situation also has a land connotation, specifically where smaller countries are concerned, where densities might be very high, and populations are high, and you might have a land conflict that would be there. So yeah, so not very strong at the moment, but definitely I would say with the upper echelons and the elite in the societies, the out-migration phenomenon is being observed.
Okay, yeah, many thanks. And I see that actually JF has reverted to protocol and put his second question in the chat. I don't think we're going to have time to answer that, but it's I think you're making the observation that the biggest, so this is directed towards Melanie, but the biggest risk for pregnant women may be the actual failure, because systemic failure of health systems, as well as the kind of the more kind of proximate kind of physiological mechanisms, I suppose. So he's talking about related to sovereign debt crises. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't see a question, so I was going to say yes. Again, like I mentioned, from a public health perspective, absolutely, because anything from prevention to treatment, we all depend on some sort of system that provides that, whether it be a standard system or with traditional support, either way. So yes, a lot of the physiological effects could hopefully be mediated or caught if you can get care early on. But yeah.
Okay, sure. I've seen that Zeenat's just put her hand up, so I think we're going to give her the last word, and then we need to finish at 2. So please.
Yeah, in 1 minute, I to continue to the question that you'd asked, that there is what we see the other kind of evidence that is happening, where where people, instead of going out to nature, we're bringing nature in to combat or to act on climate impacts. So we see a lot of cities across the world experimenting with or having within their policy strategies nature-based interventions to address these issues and looking at possibilities of the framework being so that's very much there within the policy practice that we are finding now.
Okay. Many thanks. So many thanks, Melanie, Zeenat, Roberta, and also Henry for introducing what is a really important and very powerful initiative. Apologies on behalf of Peter, he wasn't able to chair today. These postdocs, they get younger and younger, don't they, Peter? But it's great to have him contribute. And thank you, everyone, for turning up and your questions and your comments. And we'll leave it at that. Okay, bye-bye. Take care.